Diplomats are scrambling to find a peaceful solution as concerns grow that Ethiopia will fall into an all-out civil war. The conflict between Ethiopia's federal government and Tigrayan rebels started more than a year ago and continues to escalate. Now, a coalition of opposition groups are reportedly advancing on Ethiopia's capital. Meanwhile, a U.S. special envoy returned to Ethiopia for a second time since last week to work with the African Union on a ceasefire agreement. For more on this, I'd like to bring in Cameron Hudson. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Africa Center and the former director for African Affairs at the National Security Council. Cameron, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So one of the biggest concerns growing out of this conflict is the humanitarian crisis. Remind us how things got to this point and what's being done to help the people of Ethiopia.
Well, a few months ago, when the Ethiopian government started to lose their footing on the battlefield, one area of leverage that they continued to have over the Tigrayan region was humanitarian access. And so we've seen for the better part of the last 4 or 5 months, a total humanitarian blockade of the region. You've seen skyrocketing cases of famine where nearly 500,000 people now are at risk of fatality due to famine. And in the last month, there have been absolutely no shipments of any humanitarian aid whatsoever, food, medicine, anything. So this is really, I think, the last piece of leverage that the government of Ethiopia has over the rebels, trying to put pressure on them, which they're not able to do on the battlefield really anymore.
And so give us a little bit of the big picture here. What would it mean for the Horn of Africa and stability in the entire region if Ethiopia were to enter a full-blown civil war?
Well, let's remember, this is not a stable region. It has a history of coups and famines. So these are obviously not the first time we've seen these occurrences. But for Ethiopia to fall, which for the better part of the last 30 years has really been the bedrock of stability in this region. Ethiopia has been a contributor to peacekeeping operations, mediating peace in neighboring states like Sudan and South Sudan, and intervening in Somalia to fight terrorism there on behalf of the United States. To lose Ethiopia, to see this government fall, and potentially to see a massive refugee exodus. Let's remember, Ethiopia is the second largest country in Africa. Over 110 million people live there. So to see unstable states as its neighbors become taxed with an outflow of refugees or fighters could destabilize the entire region and really be catastrophic to U.S. interests.
Which is why the African Union hopes to have a ceasefire in place this week. But what is the likelihood of that, and what steps is the international community prepared to take if neither Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed or the Tigrayan rebels come to a peaceful resolution?
Well, there's clearly a full court press going on internationally. You're seeing for the first time in a long time the UN Security Council taking notice, putting out some very harsh statements, consensus statements that include China and Russia, which is surprising. And also seeing the African Union finally, I think, take a lead role in trying to bring this to some kind of ceasefire resolution. I think it's hard to say right now. Obviously, the Tigrayans are on their front feet. They are marching towards the capital. They are in the driver's seat of this conflict. The prime minister and his government, I think, are reeling right now. We're seeing them lash out at the UN, lash out at international mediators who are trying to come in and force a kind of a political dialogue. So I really think this is very personality driven right now. And it's a big question whether or not the prime minister will see the writing on the wall and walk back from the edge.
Well, you know, let's dive into that comment a little bit about being personality driven, because often these sorts of regional conflicts can be that. What do you think that each side would be willing to settle for here? Because, like you said, if it's personality driven, there's sort of pride and the rest of it all at stake here. So what do you think would be, in your professional opinion, sufficient for both sides to accept, to back down?
Well, for the Tigrayans, I think right now, the #1 priority for them is opening up humanitarian access to the region. They have stated that the reason that they're marching on the capital is to break the humanitarian siege on their people. There's 7 million people suffering from a lack of humanitarian access. So I think if the government were to break that siege and allow unlimited humanitarian access to the region, I think that would probably do the trick in the short term. Obviously, in the long term, there are political talks that have to happen, really fundamental constitutional issues of how ethnicity is treated in this country that have to be resolved. The core elements of this conflict remain unresolved. For Prime Minister Abiy, I think a unilateral ceasefire by the Tigrayans would perhaps, and also pulling back from other regions of Ethiopia that the Tigrayans have entered into, expanding this combat, trying to put pressure on Prime Minister Abiy. If they did that unilaterally, I think you would see the Prime Minister probably respond favorably. However, I think the likelihood of either side taking those steps is extremely unlikely at this point. Both sides see their very existence threatened by the other, and those maximalist positions are very hard to walk back from.
And then, of course, the Ethiopian people are the ones who suffer, caught in the middle. All right, well, Cameron Hudson, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thanks very much.